Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Does Teaching SEL Make a Difference? Presented by ACT. Today we'll discuss the importance of teaching social emotional learning skills in K-12 education as told from the perspective of educators, and also put a spotlight on ACT's latest research related to SEL. My name is Will Vallette from the Marketing Department here at ACT in Iowa City. Our presenters today are Greg Maughan, Principal at East High School in Salt Lake City, Lee Vandenacker, SEL instructor and co-author of the ACT Tessera Playbook at East High, and Jeremy Burris, Principal Research Scientist at ACT. You can ask questions anytime about the content of the webinar or technical issues using the questions panel on the right side of your screen. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar, while other questions will get a personal reply via email in the coming days. We will also send all participants a recording of today's webinar, the slideshow presentation, related research, and other information in the next few days. So with that, I'll hand the presentation over to Greg and Lee in Salt Lake City. Greg?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Just real quick, I'd like to first of all thank Lee Vandenacker for being with us today. She is a full-time teacher at East High School. She teaches a class that we call Techniques for Tough Times, and I'm also excited to hear that Gail 3, one of the original authors of Techniques for Tough Times, is out there as part of this webinar also. So thanks for being with us, everyone. I hope that by the end of our presentation, we will be able to explain and kind of help you internalize the importance of SEL and explicitly teaching SEL skills and how it can change the whole culture of your school to be more student-centered, student-managed, and have student buy-in. So one of my favorite sayings that we like to talk about at East High really focuses on the future of our students. And the North American president of LEGO, Stephen Turnipseed, says 65% of today's children will end up at jobs that have not been invented yet. And the thought of that as an educator and as a principal is just, it feels like such an undaunting task for us to, how do we prepare students for jobs that haven't even been invented yet? And it at times can feel overwhelming, especially to those who were responsible for being agents of change in the education world. So we all have to ask ourselves this question, whether we're teachers, whether we're principals, whether we're district administrators, how do we prepare our students for those jobs? Well, no matter what, we all know that reading, writing, and arithmetic are important, and they're critical skills and knowledge acquisition there. But oftentimes one of the large glaring areas that goes unnoticed or not really focused on or talked about is the social and emotional learning. And students being able to blend their content knowledge with communication and collaboration skills that help them to cross that threshold or that barrier into success. So, you know, it's always interesting to me as a principal. I love going in and watching classrooms. It's probably the favorite part of my job. And I love when I go into a classroom and I see students referring to Google and other search engines looking for information because these kids are used to you know, lightning speed access to information, and with that being said, it's so important what teachers are doing in the classroom to help, not just help kids get access to that information, but then all of the scaffolding and all of the support that deal with creativity, critical thinking, problem-solving skills, decision-making skills, so that they can really start to synthesize all of that content together in a way that is much deeper and much more meaningful to them. So a lot of people, call some of these skills social emotional learning skills. For years they were called non-cognitive or non-verbal skills. But really, as we're preparing students and kids to be 21st century learners and 21st century business people, college students, things like that, it's those social emotional skills, those non-cognitive skills that will help to determine just how successful they are in life itself, in and out of the workforce. So some of the examples of some of our social and emotional learning skills that Lee focuses on in her Techniques for Tough Times class are teamwork, collaboration, leadership, communication, emotional stability. I'm not going to read through all of them because I'm quite confident that all of you are able to read. But empathy, work ethic, critical thinking, problem solving, resiliency, grit, persistence, coping skills and coping mechanisms, having a global awareness and an open-mindedness. These are all things that that really are going to be required, that are required now in the workforce, they're required now in classrooms. Those are skills that help to build the overall success of the student in school and post high school. So before I talk about what specifically we do in our Techniques for Tough Times, I do want to briefly give you a little bit of history or a little bit of information about East High School. We are considered an urban high school. We are a minority-majority school. We've got about 43 languages spoken here at East High. We've got a very high homelessness population. In fact, we have it's such a need that we have food pantry, we have a clothing boutique, we have washroom facilities. It's a high needs school, and so I think that's important to note because oftentimes as principals, as teachers, we take the path of least resistance and think, well, that wouldn't work in my school because because of these special circumstances. And so if it can be done at East High, it can be done at any other school in the state or in the nation. So I'm going to have Lee chime in here periodically because she's really the expert of this. Our first term or first quarter, students start to learn problem-solving skills that'll help empower them to take control of some of their choices and responsibility for their actions.
Thank you, Greg. Greg and I work together, and this filters out throughout our entire school. I think a huge part of these skills right now with first quarter is our students engage in handling their own problems. So they have mini society, if you will, where they become the problem solvers and come up with their own solutions. This can be done by teaching the social emotional learning skills, and they're always interactive. We provide opportunities for them to be able to solve their own problems, and I think this is a critical piece. It's a performance-based assessment, if you will. By teaching them specifically the I messages and magic questions, going over fair fighting rules such as stay focused on the present, don't bring up the past, learn from the past, but don't continually bring up the past. Listen, be willing to change your mind, allow someone else to change their mind. All of these incredible skills that our teenagers, all students need today, are taught in this class. with our assessment piece, Tessera has helped us greatly. It has given us a baseline, if you will, that we can go off of and allow our students to take a look at so they know what they need. It's interesting as we test our students to find some of our 4.0 students who test very high on other standardized tests, maybe test lower on academic self-confidence. What this does is tells us that we need to give them more opportunities to use their voice, to engage in the critical conversations, to gain confidence, because they need self-confidence in the workforce as well as moving on to higher education.
Second term, they really start to focus on managing and taking responsibility for their emotions, which any of you who have worked in schools know that emotions are a great part of every student's day. A lot of the time spent during the day is directly tied to their emotion. So helping them to learn how to recognize and understand how their emotions directly influence their choices, their relationships with their peers, with their teachers, with administrators, with staff, with parents, really helping to identify specifically how that impacts those relationships.
Through the development of emotional maturity, our students gain empathy. With a school such as East High School, we have 45 languages spoken. It's fabulous to watch the interaction with the vast varying differences of students in our school. And the emotional maturity piece is huge for developing this and being comfortable with all populations in our school.
So the assessment includes written assignment where students self-reflect, they're able to evaluate their own growth. Part of the report includes a GPA gain and loss report for overall performance in our school. So we're not only using this assessment to tie directly into those social emotional skills, but we're taking it to that next step of how those also affect things like their GPA, their attendance rates, graduation rates, classroom success.
Our students tend to score really high in leadership and collaboration, and I really believe that's because of the opportunities gained from this class and from these skills. They demonstrate readily the different skills in hands-on interactive activities. Many of them are mentioned in the Tessera teacher playbook, and they specifically give them that opportunity to engage in leadership.
So one of the great things about this also is that students are explicitly taught how to recognize the difference between a healthy relationship and an unhealthy relationship, and clear down to a specific or individual conversation that they may be having. They understand the rescue triangle and how to evaluate their own relationship. I know for me, being able to talk to students who understand that rescue triangle, who understand the difference between a healthy and unhealthy conversation even, it's really changed the way students interact with the adults here in the building, and in turn automatically changed the relationship between adult and student as students, as kids that are in our techniques class are practicing and modeling those healthy relationship building skills and strategies in conversation.
Our students also learn how to disagree without being disagreeable. It's really a powerful skill. They learn to support their peers versus rescuing and what it looks like. All of these skills play into learning how to be assertive. Many of our students, they don't know what assertive is before they take this class. They know passive aggressive. They understand the power of sarcasm, but they realize after they learn these skills that there's great power in having a voice, in knowing how to listen, in knowing how to dialogue with powerful words instead of put downs.
I love that students start to feel like they have that voice. Oftentimes students, they'll feel like, they may feel like, what's the use in me talking to a teacher, or what's the use in me talking to the principal? It's not going to change anything. And so really that power of student voice, it empowers them to first to realize that they do have a voice, and as they work on that, they start to realize that their voice is actually the voice that we're asking for. That's the most important voice in all of our buildings. That is why we're there. Fourth term, or fourth quarter, students work on a personal essay that focuses on their own growth. It focuses on their resiliency skills, what they've learned in the class, the benefits of the class, how they've improved, how they've grown personally and within relationships that they're in, whether they be relationships at home, relationships at school, just overall the success that they've had after finishing this class.
Our students gain self-confidence, which is greatly needed to go on in life, and the resiliency piece, the power to identify their problems, if you will, to push through obstacles. Gail Threet, the original co-author of Techniques for Tough Times, has a saying that says it's hard to hate someone whose story you know, and everyone has a story. And our students learn to identify their own life story, and with that, to know they are in charge of their own life goals. And I really think this is the real power of all the social emotional learning skills. They are in charge of their own life goals, and they have those skills to be able to reach those goals. And
they focus on those things that they do have control over, and those things that they don't have control over, they don't just brush them aside. They're cognizant of those, but they really work on how to overcome some of those things that may be holding them back, or that they may not have control over. Sorry, I accidentally hit the button. I do want to share with you, this has at East High, we've got a 10-year history with this class being taught at East High. It actually has been taught for much longer than that. We were able to steal Lee away and get her here at East High because there really was a high need. I can't stress enough the importance of this type of a class, not only for the success of your students, but this is something that we provide also in our professional development for our teachers. As we get our test results back, we use those results to help build some of our professional development plan for the following year. Because if we see that students are not scoring as high in, let's say, in resiliency, then that's our job as educators to help build and strengthen students' ability to be resilient and to persevere and to have grit and stick with things. And so we include social emotional learning in our professional development when we have faculty meetings, because this isn't just a class that can impact the 210 students that Lee has. We need this to have an overall system impact, and by incorporating that classroom piece and faculty staff piece, we have had a major culture shift over the years, and our conversations that are happening now with students, with families, the conversations happening between faculty members and staff members, it's in a whole new place that oftentimes I could have only dreamt about. It's really, it helps us be able to identify where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, on how we best support our students and also best support our teachers by providing that professional development and training for educators.
And I think what it does is it empowers teachers. They don't go home feeling beaten up. They go home really feeling uplifted because they're learning from their students as well. And I think you can genuinely tell by the relationship that Greg and I have together, that's what social emotional learning skills do. They provide the avenues for all of us to work together, and we work together because we understand how to collaborate, how to listen to each other, and how to make sure everyone has a voice involved in something as important as our students' graduation and success. One thing I'd like to point out that Tessera has shown that East High School scores greater on average in all 6 of the constructs across the nation from the testing done last year. We weren't surprised by those results because we actually see them every day in the building.
That's right. Just to give a little bit of backing to that, just an example of what the Tessera assessment has shown us is that we have nearly 72% of our students scoring greater than the average comparison student in teamwork and cooperation. Curiosity and ingenuity followed teamwork and cooperation with nearly 65% of the average scores being higher. So it really does work. And I look forward to any questions you may have.
Yes, we actually, before we turn it over to Jeremy Burris to kind of handle the research section of this presentation, we have had quite a few questions come in while Greg and Lee have been speaking, questions about the techniques for Tough Times class. One is whether it's required of all students or if it's an elective, whether it's credit bearing. Lee, can you speak to that?
Yes. This is credit bearing, and that's what makes it so powerful. So this is one class period, just like any of the others. We're on an 8-block period class, and so I teach 6 periods of the same class. It's just one, and the credit is elective credit or it's social studies elective credit. And I can let Greg speak to how that plays out for our students with their schedules.
Right. So for our students, some students need the elective credit. Other students need the credit in like their social studies requirements. And so that really has been determined by the several degrees and endorsements that Lee has. And so social science elective credit met that criteria, or met the criteria of that the best. It is not a class that's been required. We are actually talking about trying to build it into a 9th grade. We're a 9 through 12 high school. We've been talking about adding this as a requirement for all 9th graders to take for a semester. It's more than a semester class, but this, if we were to do it with our 9th grade as a semester, it would be a pared down version. And then those students that really need more support, we would work on putting them into the techniques class their sophomore or junior or senior year.
In our district, we have seen this class used in our junior highs as a semester class for 8th graders, and it's worked beautifully, and they have seen tremendous results as well.
Yep. In fact, it's in every high school in our district now.
One quick note, and then we'll get to one more question. For those of you who've been asking, East High School is in Salt Lake City. That's where Greg and Lee are coming to us from. And one other question about the techniques class that you've been describing. We had a question about Lee's background as an SEL teacher, and also whether the class is a vetted curriculum.
Okay, thank you. I've taught for 25 years. I keep telling Greg I'm retiring, and he keeps talking me into one more. I actually started in another district for 15 years, and then they convinced me to come over to Salt Lake District, where I've been for the last 10 years. And background, as far as my individual degrees, definitely minor in sociology, psychology, special ed, and conflict resolution. However, I have trained many teachers. They are wonderful. They don't have the same background I have. I have Spanish speaking teachers, English teachers, math teachers. I really believe if they want to learn about the social emotional learning skills, that has to be a part of it, and they have to be trained. But if they are a teacher, they are a teacher and can teach this curriculum. But that's the key part. The teachers that I have worked with, they are full-time teachers.
I would say most critical, most key to the success of our program, I think, is that Lee makes the difference. It cannot be a top-down approach. You do need a principal who's very supportive of social emotional learning, and that's critical. But even more critical than that, I think, is having the right person. It starts with hiring. My job as the principal is to hire the very best for my students, and so getting the right person to teach a class that focuses on those SELs, that is the most important part, because that's where it's going to have a direct impact on students.
But I do have to say the co-author of techniques, Gail Threed, is a counselor, and she's amazing, and she uses all of these techniques in her counseling in groups and has also seen tremendous results. So I think there's many different settings that you can use and teach the social emotional learning skills. This is just the one that we use, and that's the one that has worked so well for us.
And we've really, I know you're probably short on time, but we've really appreciated the information we get back from the our test results, because that assessment, it really does show us that what we're doing is having it's working, it's having an impact, and it's successful.
Okay, thank you, Greg and Lee. You can continue to send in questions for Greg and Lee as our presentation continues. But with that, I'm going to hand this over to Jeremy Burris, a principal research scientist at ACT, who's going to tell us about some of ACT's research regarding SEL.
Okay, thanks, Greg and Lee. As Will said, my name is Jeremy Burris. I'm at on the ACT SEL team. SEL stands for the Assessment of Social, Emotional, and Academic Learning. Online answering some of your questions, we have two other SEL team members. That's Dana Morano and Richard Roberts. And today I'm going to talk about what does the research say about social and emotional learning. Fortunately, the research, to give you a little preview, totally validates what Greg and Lee told you just a second ago. But before we get into the research, I think it would be useful for us to all get on the same page about what it is that we mean when we say social and emotional learning. So here we have ACT's definition of social and emotional learning. It's basically interpersonal and self-regulatory and task-related behaviors that are important for the adaptation to and successful performance in education and workplace settings. Now, when you see things like this, like social emotional learning, you see a lot of labels. One of these Greg referred to as non-cognitive skills, but they're also referred to as things like soft skills, personal skills, and 21st century skills. Basically, all of these labels mean the same thing, but we go with social emotional learning at ACT because that term seems to resonate the best with educators and parents. Something else to consider is that there are a lot of skills that tend to be associated with social emotional learning. there tend to be so many of these skills that pop up that it's hard to know, what should be included as a social emotional learning skill, and if these skills are the same or different. So for example, you hear about grit, persistence, collaboration, teamwork, resilience, coping, etc. There's a lot of these skills that pop up, but sometimes it's hard to know if, for example, grit and persistence are the same thing or if they're something else. So what might help us to solve this problem of kind of not knowing which terminology we should use and what should be counted as an SEL skill or not would be to have a general organizing framework with which we could use to help us define and categorize these skills. And we think we've found the best organizing framework possible at ACT in the Big 5 personality factors. Now, the Big 5 personality factors were discovered by taking all of the adjectives in the dictionary that could describe a person and having people rate themselves on all of these adjectives, on how descriptive they were of them. And then you can use a statistical technique called factor analysis to reduce all of these adjectives to a smaller number of factors. And this is what comes out in the Big 5. First, you have conscientiousness. This is how detail-focused or industrious you are, how hardworking you are. Agreeableness, that's kind of being cooperative and altruistic. Neuroticism, or what's also called emotional stability, which is how well you tolerate stress and how resilient you are. Openness, which is kind of how intellectual, innovative, creative you are, open to other cultures and people. And extroversion, which, as you know, is kind of how talkative or assertive or sociable you are. And so these big five factors have been, in research, have been replicated thousands of times over the past several decades now, and across most countries. And also because of the way it was developed by using all of the adjectives in the dictionary, it also tends to be very comprehensive. And it's so comprehensive that what you can do then is you can use it to categorize nearly every social emotional learning skill that you come across. So here you have the big 5 factors across the top row, and then you have corresponding social emotional learning skills that are categorized within each of these 5 factors. And you can see, for example, that grit and persistence are indeed essentially the same thing. They're all kind of aspects of conscientiousness. So we use the big 5 here to categorize all of these social emotional skills kind of parsimoniously, to have a simple and meaningful categorization of these skills that everybody can understand. So now that we have kind of our framework, the next question you should ask is, do these skills really matter? Do each of these 5 skills actually matter for academics and work and life in general? So that's what we'll go into next. Are these social emotional learning skills actually important in school? Well, clearly, meta-analyses say they do. So a meta-analysis is a statistical technique for combining several studies to create one overall generalization. And what you find here is that in primary, secondary, and tertiary school, so basically in elementary, middle school, high school, and college, you find that at least some of these big 5 factors predict grades. Along the bottom row, you also see cognitive ability tests, which also predict grades. One important thing to note here is that by the time you get to tertiary school or college, conscientiousness is just as good of a predictor of grade point average as is cognitive ability. Now, as has been mentioned several times before, we have our own social emotional learning assessment that's based on the big 5 at ACT called Tessera. That's a middle school and a high school assessment, and it assesses each of those 6 constructs that you see in each of these tables. Here you can see the correlation of each of the Tessera constructs or skills with grades, and you can see that each of the skills are pretty strong predictors of grades. Now, oftentimes people don't necessarily have a good sense of what the size of correlations means, so I added a table here to give you a better sense of exactly what these correlations might mean. So people are often surprised when they see that the correlation of sugar consumption to a child's behavior is actually 0.00, that the correlation of aspirin to your chance of having a heart attack death is 0.02, The correlation of parental divorce to child well-being, a child's well-being is 0.09. Lead exposure to a child's IQ is only 0.12. Something that seems to be very surprising to people is the correlation between whether you use ibuprofen and your pain reduction is only 0.14. Alcohol and aggressive behavior is 0.23. The correlation of ACT or SAT scores to first-year GPA is 0.37, and gender to height is only 0.67. Now, when you look at the tessera correlations, you can find that we are performing just as well and sometimes better than the correlation that you find for ACT and SAT and first-year college GPA. Now, let's take a closer look at the organization responsibility correlation for middle school of 0.45. Here we have a chart that shows what the odds are for students to get the best grades, for them to have an A or A plus GPA by their organization responsibility scores. Now, when students are below average in organization responsibility, as according to their tessera scores, they have a 20% chance of having an A or A plus GPA. And what we mean by below average is that they're in the bottom 25% of scores on organizational responsibility. As we go higher, we get slightly below average. This is 25 to 50th percentile. We see about 38% have A or A plus GPA. When you get to slightly above average, almost 50% of those students have an A or A plus GPA. But then when you get to the above average students, these are the students that score in the top 25% of Tessera's organization responsibility scale. About 72% of these students have an A or A plus GPA. So this gives you a sense of how strong this 0.45 correlation is. The above average students get about 72% of them have an A or A plus GPA, whereas the below average students, only 20% of them have an A or A plus GPA. Now, obviously grades are important, but that's not the only thing that we're interested in when we think about what students are doing at school. Now, this is some data that was collected by Richard Roberts, who's on the SEL team at a high school in New Jersey. Here you have in the rows, you have the SSAT score. That's an academic achievement test score. These students' conscientiousness scores, and their teacher's rating of their non-cognitive or SEL skills, kind of a global rating. You can see that each of these three does a pretty good job of predicting GPA. But the story gets more interesting when you look at other important outcomes. For example, when you look at class outcomes, or class absences, you find that conscientiousness and the teacher ratings of their non-cognitive or social emotional learning skills is a much stronger prediction of whether somebody's going to be absent for class. Same story goes for discipline, whether these students are going to be disciplined at some point. And interestingly, the same story occurs for infirmary visits. Students who are more conscientious and students whose teachers rate them as having higher SEL skills tend to report sick less often. So these social emotional learning classes can also, social emotional learning skills can also help us predict how soon a student is going to graduate high school, and even if they're going to graduate high school at all. So this is a pretty recent study that was conducted by people at ACT, which showed that social emotional learning skills such as orderly conduct, academic discipline, and optimism either directly or indirectly predicted on-time graduation from high school. And something important to note here is that these social emotional learning skills, conduct, discipline, and optimism, were measured 4 years earlier. They were measured in 8th grade, and then the outcome that we were interested in, on-time graduation, was measured 4 years later. So clearly, social emotional learning skills make an important difference for academic outcomes. But academic outcomes aren't the only thing that we really care about. Another thing we're worried about is, well, do these social emotional learning skills actually have an impact at work? Well, people certainly think they do. This is simply the results of a survey that was taken in Great Britain recently. There are several surveys like this that were also taken in the United States, but I included this one because this is relatively recent. This actually came out just this month. Here you can see that young people, employers, and teachers all, the great majority of them agreed that life skills are either just as important or more important than academic skills in the success of a young person. Um, when we're talking about the workforce, it's important to note that 94% of employers thought that these, what they were calling life skills, were just as or more important than academic skills in work performance. Now, importantly, meta-analyses predict job performance across several factors of job performance. So this table shows basically a summary of several different meta-analyses that show each of the big 5 factors significantly predict job performance, performance on specific tasks. They also predict organizational citizenship behavior. Now, organizational citizenship behavior are kind of extra things that you do at work that are not really part of your job but make the workplace better. This is things like helping out your coworkers even if you don't have to, or even putting in extra work even when it's not required of you. Interestingly, also, each of the big 5 factors predicts counterproductive work behavior, such that, for example, the more conscientious you are, the less likely you are to engage in counterproductive work behaviors, which are things like stealing from work, gossiping, being aggressive at work, and showing up late. Importantly, these social emotional learning skills also predict workforce outcomes over long periods of time. So in this first study here, we have a nationally representative sample of Americans. So this is a study that basically represents all Americans, that showed that a 1 standard deviation increase in each of the big 5 factors led to an increase in income 11 years as measured 11 years later. And you can see the numbers in the increase in income based on your improvement in each of these big 5 factors. Relatedly, there's also a nationally representative study of Swedish men, which showed that a 25-minute interview that was designed to measure social emotional learning characteristics in 18 and 19-year-old Swedish men was actually a better predictor of wages and unemployment 14 to 21 years later than were cognitive ability measures. So over time and over long periods of time, you see at least 20 years, over 20 years, we can predict job success based on these social emotional learning factors. So performance is important. Obviously, performance at school is important and performance at work is important, but that's not the only thing that we really care about when we're raising our sons and daughters. There's other aspects of life that are also related to social and emotional learning factors. For example, one meta-analysis showed that each of these factors, except for, in this case, openness to experience, was significantly related to happiness in adults, or what's also called subjective well-being. So just as a point of reference, I once again am putting these results from other research just to show you that there's effects for the relationship of social emotional learning to happiness are actually pretty strong when you compare it to research from other fields. Interestingly, we can also predict mortality from these factors. So here you see conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism or emotional stability, and agreeableness, the correlations of those factors with how soon you are to actually die. What you can see from this table, or this graph, is that this relationship with conscientiousness to mortality is actually higher than in the relationship of IQ to mortality. And the relationship of all of the other personality factors is actually higher than the relationship of socioeconomic status to mortality. So it's important to note when you look at this table that this is low conscientiousness, for example. So the lower you are in conscientiousness, the more likely you are to die early. There's similar results also for divorce. Conscientiousness, neuroticism, and agreeableness also pretty strongly predict your likelihood to one day get divorced, and importantly, they are much stronger predictors of divorce than is socioeconomic status. So it's a finding that some may find somewhat surprising. So one kind of criticism that we get when we tell people that we are basing our definition of social emotional learning on personality factors is that, well, everybody knows that personality is fixed at an early age, and so there's no way that they can improve. Well, that's actually a misconception. Research has shown pretty convincingly that personality actually does change substantially over the lifetime. Now, this is the result. What you find here is the results of another meta-analysis that shows that each of the big 5 factors changes substantially throughout the lifetime and even into old age. Now, some other evidence that we can actually change these factors comes from other meta-analytic evidence on social emotional learning courses, such as Technique for Tough Times. So, for example, one meta-analysis showed that social emotional learning programs as taught at school led to an increase in 23% increase in social emotional learning skills, and also importantly, an 11% increase in standardized achievement test scores. Now, there was also a more recent follow-up meta-analysis to this one that showed that these effects persist over long periods of time. Finally, there's also economic research from the field of economics that shows that these social emotional learning programs have a strong benefit for society. Specifically, every $1 invested in social emotional learning programs leads to an $11 long-term benefit for society, and that's as a result of things like reduced juvenile crime, higher lifetime earnings, and better mental and physical health. So the evidence is pretty convincing that we can actually improve these social emotional learning skills, as Lee and Greg told you before I started talking. So just to sum up, what do we know? We know that the social emotional learning skills may be best classified according to the big 5 dimensions. We know that they're important for school. They predict things like grade point average, attendance, and discipline. We know they're important for work. They predict things like job performance and organizational citizenship behaviors, and importantly, we can predict work performance over longitudinally over long periods of time by using these skills. They're also important for life in general. They predict things like happiness, health, and well-being. And finally, we know that we can improve them through social emotional learning programs, such as Lee Vandenacker's Technique for Tough Times, and hopefully through things like the Tessera Teacher Playbook. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, and with that, we're going to turn it over to questions. We've had several questions come in today. Just to answer one question we've gotten quite a bit of, early next week you'll receive a recording of today's webinar in addition to the slides that you're seeing. So if you'd like to share those with colleagues, you're welcome to do that. One question for Jeremy, actually one question we've had many times because Lee and Greg talked about the Tessera product. This isn't a product presentation, but a lot of people kind of would like to, who are just hearing about Tessera for the first time, would like a quick description of what the Tessera program is and what it does.
Yeah. So Tessera is a social emotional learning assessment for middle school and high school students. There's 2 different assessments. They're very similar in structure, but there's one that's made for middle school students and one that's made for high school students. They are Big 5 based, but we test 6 constructs. We have six skills or constructs instead of 5 because we have 2 conscientiousness constructs, because conscientiousness tends to be the strongest predictor of all the constructs. And so one difference between Tessera as compared to other social emotional learning assessments is that we have multiple assessment methods. Other assessments tend to rely only on self-reported type scales, where students are basically telling you, you ask them questions like, I am hardworking, and they either agree or disagree to that kind of a question. And all of us know kind of intuitively and from the research that those types of questions, while they tend to have some validity and reliability, are also subject to a lot of potential problems, such as, for example, they're easy to fake. It's easy to fake your answers on these types of questions. So we have 3 assessment methodologies to get around a lot of those issues in Tessera. We have something called forced choice assessment, where students are asked to respond to 3 statements. Some of them are kind of equivalently socially desirable, which means they're very hard to fake. And you're asked which one is most like you and which one is least like you of the 3 statements. And we also ask situational judgment test questions, where students are presented with scenarios that are things that they would see in real life in their classrooms, and are asked how they would respond to those scenarios. And then we also do have some of those self-report items. so we have that assessment piece where and students and schools are provided with reports on each of these six, on the performance on each of these six skills. And then we also have the intervention or the curriculum piece, which has been referred to a couple times here, called the Tessera Teacher Playbook, which Lee Vandenacker was a co-author on, and which incorporates some of the activities from Techniques for Tough Times. And that, at the moment, focuses on three of our constructs: tenacity, grit, teamwork, cooperation, and resilience. And we have lessons and activities for each of those three constructs. And that's it for right now.
Okay. Another question for Jeremy from Victor, who wants to know about CASEL competencies, C-A-S-E-L, and how those competencies come into play with the research that you were discussing.
Yeah, the CASEL competencies map up very well to the Big Five, and in fact, there was a paper that was commissioned by the OECD, which explicitly tried to map up SEL frameworks to the Big Five, and they had a pretty easy time mapping up the CASEL competencies to the Big Five in that paper. And so the basic mapping, well, we can actually send you that paper. Probably don't want to go over the basic mapping right now, but there's a pretty easy mapping. Like the decision-making one was mapped up to conscientiousness, and then you can see how basically there's CASEL has some emotional competencies which would map up to, for example, the emotional stability of Big Five, and there's some social competencies which would map up to both the agreeableness and the extroversion components of the Big Five. So that maps up pretty well.
Okay, we've got a question for Greg and Lee, and this is from Catherine, who wants to know if East High faculty go through any professional development related to SEL.
That's a great question, and since we just had a great lesson on it, I'm going to turn it over to Greg and let him tell you what happened.
So we do integrate that into our faculty professional development. This last Monday, we had a 90-minute professional development with our whole faculty. I've got about 110 teachers or so, and we focused a lot of it on the locus of control. You know, what's in your hoop of control, what's out of your hoop of control, and we started that professional development piece off with specifically what's within the hoop of control for educators, what's out of the hoop. An example might be attendance. You know, oftentimes we as educators, we say, well, if kids would come to class, they'd do better. And while that certainly probably is true, that's out of someone's hoop of control. And so starting that professional development with from the educator standpoint, and then transitioning that down to their individual students, the things that are within students' hoops of control, individual hoops of control, and what's out, and how do we then, as their teachers, as their administrators, help empower them to be able to be change agents among themselves.
Also, quickly, some of the major things that we teach have to do with de-escalating intense situations, where before learning these skills, you might kick them up a little bit. Teachers are trained so that they know how to ask more questions, to listen, to be patient, to really try and understand where the student's coming from. All of the social emotional learning play greatly into how they respond in certain situations.
Great. We have another question from Daryl, who wants to know, as a result of teaching SEL, has there been a reduction in the kinds of issues that counselors would handle on a day-to-day basis there at East High? And also, do counselors have a role in the techniques course?
Counselors have a huge role in the techniques course because they lead out, model, they do the counseling part, and as we said before, I do the teaching part, but I don't try and overlap with the counselors. We need them to do the counseling part. So they're very, very instrumental with it. But yes, we do see a decrease in some of the reasons why our students need to go to the counselors, because they're able to problem solve for themselves as well as with their peers. And their peers, quite frankly, tend to get them help with other teachers or coaches, but not counseling issues. Counseling issues need to go to the counselors, and we really respect the boundaries on that.
And the other important role that counselors play, and more so, even as administrators, we play a role in this, but not nearly as much as the counselors do. The counselors are helping build student schedules. And so helping to make sure that that students are getting into the techniques class is one of the big ways that counselors support the Techniques for Tough Times class. I can tell you, based on data, we still, each year, we see a reduction in behavior referrals to the office, things like that. These are all things that much of that credit we attribute that back to the SEL skills that are being taught in our building.
Okay, here's a question for Jeremy. This comes from Karen. How do you measure perseverance, and how do we determine what's enough or not enough perseverance?
Yeah, we measure perseverance by basically with those three methods that we discuss. And so, for example, there are situational judgment test items, for example, where we present students with scenarios where things might not be going right, or things are taking longer than they had anticipated, or they're, for example, presented with another situation that they might want to do. So they, for example, you might be doing your homework, and then you might be have a bunch of your friends who want to go out with you, and you really want to go out with them, but you also need to do your homework, and they're asked to, indicate how they would behave in certain situations. And then we have the self-report and the forced choice type items as well that also kind of ask questions related to perseverance. We have a good sense, a good idea that our perseverance items are working pretty well because they tend to be the most highly correlated of our 6 skills. They tend to be most highly correlated with grades, as you would expect. How do you know which is when is too much perseverance? I tend to be of the belief that it's really hard to find too much perseverance. I know that there's a belief out there, and it's probably true, that you can have too much grit and you can have too much perseverance, and then you just butt your head against the wall and you continue to spin your wheels when you should actually be giving up. And that's certainly true, and we all know probably people who do that, but I also think that it's rare. And so for our assessment, I think in general, the more perseverance or the more grit, the better. To find kind of these maladaptive levels of grit and perseverance, I think may actually require a whole new assessment that is designed to get at those maladaptive levels. So in general, I think the more the better, and there's going to be a rare exception where somebody just might display too much.
Okay, and we have time for one more question, and actually I'm going to combine them. It's for Greg and Lee. We had a couple of questions about whether the techniques class is also being used at your local middle school in addition to high school, and also question from that one's from BB, and then a question from Christine about how do you get student buy-in for the techniques class?
Yes to the first part of that question. It is being taught in our junior highs, and it's fabulous there. And the buy-in comes from the students actually in the class themselves, and as their skills are changed and their friends see it, then their friends want the same class. And so we really allow the students to model the skills and tell other students about the class. And I'm going to let Greg answer that.
We also, it's also been so successful that we have a lot of parents that want their students in the class. In fact, Lee and I have been talking about based on feedback from parents. We've got a lot of parents who would like us to do an SEL class focusing on parents, where parents would come in and and gain those same SEL skills. Because it's really funny. One of my most affluent families, I was talking to a parent at the end of this last year, and she said, you know what, I wish I could take Lee's class because I'm learning from my daughter how I should be acting or how I should be responding to things. And so if you could do something for parents, it would help me be able to support, in this case, their daughter. It would help me be able to support her, and it would also help in all of my relationships. So it's something that goes beyond just students. Part of the focus of this, honestly, is we do feel like part of our job is to try and break the cycle of poverty, and SEL skills, we believe, are probably the best way to combat that cycle.
Okay, and with that, we're at the top of the hour, and I'd like to thank Jeremy, Greg, and Lee for presenting our webinar today. Remember that you'll receive a recording of today's presentation and slideshow in the coming days, along with links to reports and information contained in the presentation. In the meantime, you can follow ACT on social media to learn about upcoming webinars and special events. You can find our social media channels at www.act.org/social. So thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.